Planning can be so useful for tackling a new project without getting overwhelmed. But what should we actually put in the project plan to ensure that our project is planned as well as it could be? I figured I'd find out by setting up 4 project plans for distinctly different projects. And in the lineup we have a house project, a social event, a learning project, and also a work project, which we're going to look at first. This project plan has 7 different sections, the first of which is a project details space. In here you could write stuff like your deadline, any collaborators you're working with, the purpose of the project, really anything that is that kind of baseline information. Depending on the project, you might need more space than just a quarter of a page, but I've tried to set these up so that we have the full thing on one spread. Some projects are larger, they're going to take up more space, and some are smaller, they may only need 1 page. Having those details at the start though, in a handy, easy to find location, could be really useful. The next space we have is for brainstorming. This could just be for getting your initial thoughts about the project out onto paper, either with regards to stuff you want to do, things that you want to kind of accomplish or meet with this project, things you might need to find out or research. Again, depends on the project. And you might want to do this in a list style like we have here, or use something like a mind map so that you can connect your ideas together. If you are working with other people, it might be good to have this brainstorming space in a more collaborative space rather than in your personal journal, but it can be good as a starting point to get your thoughts onto paper. For work projects in particular, a space to list out your outcomes that you're trying to hit could be useful. You can see I've written this one out as if it would be a checklist of items, but depending on your outcomes, you might want this in a table format or done as a graph. For instance, if you have certain amounts that you want to hit, maybe amount of users or sales, amounts spent or saved. Again, very project specific. For work projects in particular, what can be good to have are the guidelines or requirements that you need to either meet or work within. Having these in your journal as a handy reference could be really useful, just to make sure that when you're undertaking any work on the project, you're keeping these in mind and working within them. You could choose to write these into your journal in a list like we have here, or if you have a project brief, then you could just stick that in. If you do projects of a similar nature on a kind of like repeated basis, then having a template that you stick into your journal could be useful too. That could also work for something like the details section that we talked about before. One of my favorite things to include with any project is a roadmap, which funnily enough is kind of like a map of the project. So starting here, working across, and all of the steps in between. This one is read from left to right and just shows you the steps that you're going to take, and in particular the order that you're going to take them in. So for instance, this one starts with a meeting, it then has a step after this, and then once that one is completed, it branches off into 3 different sections. These 3 steps would come after the meeting, but don't necessarily come one after each other. This one of course is just drawn out as an example, but a project plan I actually have used before was this one, which is the one that I set up when I was doing my project for the Bullet Journal Basics series. This was a video series that was a little bit more in depth and everything was kind of interconnected, so I drew out this map for myself so I knew what I had to do in which order. So starting here, we had an initial brainstorm of the different topics I might want to include, checking a variety of different spaces for more ideas, and then considering do I want to keep them or not, sorting those out, so on and so forth. Obviously this one is a little bit messy, which is why it ended up on the scrap paper. I like things to be a little bit neater when I put them in my journal, but starting on scrap paper to map things out can be really useful too. A related idea is that of a timeline, and you could set it up like this one, where you have targets and milestones, or it could be a timeline done in terms of action steps. The column we have here that starts with a W, the intention behind this one is that you could tie each of those targets and milestones to a week number. Depending on the project, if it has a smaller time frame, you might want to make that day number, but as you hit those targets or milestones, you can just check them off to say they have been accomplished. What you might also like to do, especially if you're specifying when you'd like to have these done by, is also putting in when they actually happened. So did they happen earlier than scheduled or later than scheduled? Just as a way to kind of keep track of whether you are on target or if maybe your project is lagging behind. Essentially a way to see how expectations and reality line up or don't. A part that I think is pretty much essential for any project is an actions list, or effectively a task list of the things you need to do. But if you're working with other people, then a format like this could be really useful. In this one we have a column for each of the collaborators on the project, along with a column here just as a space to put in a bullet for the task, but then depending on who the task gets assigned to, you put a secondary bullet underneath their name. This is effectively an application of the Alistair method. We have a separate video on that one, but it's a really nice way to keep track of not only which tasks need to be done, but also which ones you need to do specifically versus people you might want to check in with to make sure that their stuff's getting done too. When setting up the project plans in this video, I was working on a very modular basis. So any of these items can be switched out for something else, effectively anything on the subsequent plans, really just whatever fits the project you're working on. These ones were specifically selected because they would work for a work project, but flipping over, and our next idea is a house project. So something that you might want to do around the house, whether that's a renovation project or maybe revamping a space, whatever your house project is. But the first module or section we have is again a timeline, but this one is structured in a slightly different way. So we still have a week number along the side, but then we have 2 columns to specify happenings on a Saturday and happenings on a Sunday. For a good chunk of us, those are the days where we're actually going to be able to tackle our home projects. So thinking about your timeline, what can I actually get done on each of those days for each week? Again, you might want to expand this one out so it's not just sitting in a quarter of a page, but it's a nice way to break down your work so you're not trying to work on everything all at once. When it comes to a house project, these can get a little expensive sometimes, so setting yourself a budget for the project could be useful. This one is set up so you just list out any of the items that you need to purchase, or services, and then list out the price of those. Then you can total it up at the bottom. Depending on how detailed you want to get with this, you could also have a section for expected or budgeted price versus actual price, again to see how expectations and reality align. But actually writing this down and having targets for each of them can help make sure that we do not go over budget or spend beyond our means. The section that we have down here no longer has a header, but this could be a space for some kind of mood board or a place to put down your research notes. If you're aiming towards a general aesthetic or vibe when it comes to redoing a space, whether that be like a home office or your lounge room, your bedroom, whatever else, having some inspiration pictures could be quite useful. So you can collect those and stick them in your journal as kind of like a mood board or vision board type deal. This can also include things like paint swatches, pictures of specific elements, so for instance lighting, handles, whatever else, or it could take a form of more like journaled out thoughts. This could also be a space where you put down any priorities for the project as well. Another idea in the realm of money is something like a savings space, so either to track the savings that you're putting aside for your project, or done as more of a plan so that you know how much you need to save when to make sure that you can pay for the project when the time comes. I've done this one as a little graph, so time, maybe weeks along the bottom, and then amount saved total along the side. But you could also set this one up as a bar graph or a table. Really just depends on how you want to break your savings down. Over on the right though, our next idea is a floor plan. This one will again depend on what type of home project you're doing, but it can be really useful to have a space to map out where you want things to go, especially if you do your floor plan in a way that's to scale. That way you can see if things will actually fit in the orientations you want them, and it can be very useful doing this on paper before you commit to moving all your furniture around. If you are going to go with a to-scale version of your floor plan, using something like graph paper can be really useful. You can also use your dot grid notebook, though graph paper has smaller divisions, so it might be a little easier. If you're getting other people to work on your home project, then having a contacts list can be really useful. So breaking it down by who's doing what, for instance, electrician, painter, so on and so forth, writing out their contact details and their names so that you know who you're dealing with. It also means that if anything kind of pops up after the project is finished, you know who to get in touch with to either call them back so that they can do more work for you, or if you have any queries, who to get in touch with. Another aspect that you might need for this kind of project is a shopping list, or things that you need to purchase. I've broken this one down so it's based on location, so that you go to store 1, buy all of these things, and then go to store 2 and buy all of these things, just so that then you don't miss out on any of your items thinking you were gonna get it at the other store and then didn't end up getting it. You can also elaborate on these ones by considering who has sales on, depending on what kind of things you need to buy. But our next section is a space for just material details. This could be for things like warranties, the specific colors that you're using, any kind of invoice details, effectively for any information that would be good to have during the project, but also after the fact, just in case you maybe need to repaint a wall and need to know the exact brand and color, or if there's a fault with an item and you need to get in touch with the person who manufactured it. As said, any of these sections can be swapped out for the ones that we already looked at, or vice versa, but our next project plan is related to a social event. Again, each of these sections have been specifically selected because they would work well in planning a social event, but the first item is venue planning. So writing out the details for the venue, things like where it is, what times you're allowed to be there, any other details like costs, setup requirements, things that are included or not included, depends on what details you have available to you and what's important to include. And just like every other section, you might need some more space for this rather than just a quarter of the page, or you might need even less space if you're not recording that many details. With planning a social event, a pretty important part is a guest list. I've again set this one up using the Alistair method, so we have a place to write down each of the people you've invited, and then we have separate columns to indicate that yes, they have been invited, they've RSVP'd, they've specifically RSVP'd saying that they're going to be coming along, did they attend, and did you send them a thank you note? You won't necessarily need all of these for every single event, and you might have some other specific things you want to record, maybe for instance allergy information or anything like that. But the next idea we have is that of a seating plan. Of course, this will only apply to specific types of events, and you could choose to just list out who will be on each table or specifically place them around the table. I've set this one up just in a table format, so a box for each of the different tables where you can write in who's going to be sitting there. But you could also do this one in more of a kind of graphic form by actually drawing out little tables and then labeling who's sitting around them. And you can find some pretty good templates online for just printing those off and sticking them in as well. Our next section I've split into two, so we have decoration planning, so things that you want to buy and things that you want to make. In this you could also plan out where certain decorations are going to go, so maybe including that floor plan like we had before and specifying different items in different places. Or you could just keep it in a list format like we have here. And then at the bottom we have the idea of invite details. So things that are going to be really important to include on your invitations so that your guests know what is happening, when it is happening, where it is happening, anything effectively that they need to know. This could also include items like a dress code, if it's BYO, if there's anything else they need to bring, a schedule, directions, whatever else. Speaking about the idea of an event schedule, this could be something you include in your plan, so effectively drawing out a timeline for the event and specifying what is happening when. I've done this one so that you could also list a couple of things that you need to do in each of the different blocks of time, but this can help you see the amount of time available to each of the different things that you need to get done. When it comes to events, a lot of the time they are revolving around food, so having a food plan or a menu could be useful. For this one, I've again opted to use the Alistair method, so a list of what the food items are, and then columns to check off if they have dairy, gluten, if it includes nuts, or if it's vegetarian or vegan, just so that you have that information in case any of your guests have any allergies or intolerances. This also could be combined with planning little signs to put out for those food items, especially in the case of something like a buffet, so that as people are going through, they know what they can and can't eat. Something that you see quite commonly with larger events like weddings and the like is a timelined task list. So considering set periods before the event and what needs to be done in those spans of time. For instance, the day of the event, the day before the event, a few days before the event, the week before, 2 weeks before, the month before, even up to something like a year or more before this event happens. Rather than having all of your tasks just in one big list, you have them in these separate smaller lists so that you can focus on the right thing at the right time. As shown, you can switch any of these out for any of the ones we've already talked about, so like the floor plan, maybe including a budget, a shopping list. But flipping on over, and the next project plan we have is a learning project. So in particular, thinking about people who are students or are wanting to undertake some kind of like new skill building or anything like that. The first idea we have on this project plan though is a resource list. So if you're a student, this could be who your lecturer or teacher is, how to get in touch with them, what are their contact hours. This could also be information about any tutorial groups, and then also any other resources you have. So textbooks, digital resources, anything like that. Having all of those resources in one place makes it a handy go-to list. Another element that you might want to include in your learning project plan is a place to write down any milestones or accomplishments that you have. This one's a little bit different to the one that we had on the work project, where we had targets and milestones, because this one is more of something you record after the fact. It's kind of like memory keeping, but specifically related to your learning project. This is just a nice little way to celebrate your success as you're going through working on the project. One of the things that I found super helpful when I was a teacher was something like a workflow space. So thinking about all of the topics that we were planning out, in particular I was thinking about them in terms of lessons, and then all of the different things I needed to do for each of those lessons. If you're learning this material or studying it, it might be having attended the lesson, writing down any questions that you had, doing the readings, taking notes, making flashcards, essentially any of the steps that you want to undertake to learn that material. Depending on how many topics you have to cover, you might want to use a full page or spread this across 2. But the next idea we have is a calendar layout. You can see this one utilizes many calendars, but stacks them one on top of another so that you effectively have this running timeline of weeks 0 through to 14 in the space that I have. I've used a line to divide each of the months, and then circles to indicate dates where things are happening. You can then write out what's happening on each of those dates in the list section here, and I've also included a checkbox so you can tick off when they've happened. This is especially good for things like assignment calendars, your test schedule, anytime you have labs or tutorials going on, or if you're not doing this in a traditional learning format, these could be deadlines that you're setting for yourself. Another useful element that can be good for this style of project is a Kanban board. So in particular, thinking about them in terms of assignment work or homework, you'd write out each piece of work on a sticky note, one that's big enough to fit inside your Kanban board, and then move it down through the different stages as you complete them. So for instance, our top box is just things that are yet to be started. Moving down to the second box, it means that that piece of work has been formally assigned. Then you can review the piece of work, draft out your responses, finalize them, and then submit them. As said, this module can be really useful for our other types of projects too, so you might find that this is particularly useful for work projects. But our next idea is that of an outcomes tracker. This can be a place to track graded work and what you received for each of those pieces. You could be setting yourself some goals for your learning project and checking off when you've done those things. I've set this one up as a little table based on the idea of having some assignments, tests, and exam, and then the percentage that each of those contribute to an overall grade. Depending on the length of your project, it can also be really useful to have something like a progress tracker, both in terms of the time that you have remaining for your project and also the amount of work you still have to do for your project. Or you could think about it in terms of the time elapsed and the tasks completed. This can just be a nice little visual representation of how much work you have to do compared to how much time you have left to do it. While these project plans are just examples, we do have a separate video with even more ideas for this kind of functional planning. That one is more specifically targeted towards professional work, but there are still some great ideas regardless of what kind of projects you're undertaking. That one's linked on screen here, so click or tap on that one and I'll see you over there.